Chapter 5 Blood Changes. In the stone cave, with the help of some starlight, you can see Kangchon is sitting on the ground. In front of him, full of serious and grave Danwong. As for the golden monkeys still studying, how the green small tripod suddenly become bigger and back, did not notice this side of the situation. Kangchon, whose mind had settled down, had wanted to taste the flavor of the Foundation establishment Dan. After all, it was a legendary pill, and his heart could not help but be curious. But this pill melted in his mouth, and quickly transformed into a sizzling torrent that went down his throat, and entered the dantian in his body, and then flowed out of the dantian into all his limbs and veins. The whole process was so fast that Kangchon had no way to savor the taste of the Foundation building Dan. Of course, Kangchon's biggest worry at this time was still the Foundation establishment. At this moment, his mind was tightly guarded, carefully focusing on the changes within his body. The medicinal power of the Foundation establishment pill was very large, even more than Kangchon could imagine. He couldn't imagine that the tiny pill contained such a huge amount of energy. With this huge energy, Kangchon's cultivation rapidly skyrocketed, but in a few moments, he rose to the peak of the 9th level of the Qi practicing stage, which was the same as when he had impacted the Foundation establishment stage not long ago. Originally, it would have taken him a year to cultivate to this point, but a small elixir allowed him to advance by a year. For the first time, Kangchon felt the power of alchemists and realized why they had such a supreme status amongst cultivators. However, this was obviously not the time to lament, because next came the crucial moment of foundation building. The so-called foundation building is actually to open up all the meridians in the body, so that the meridians in the body to form a circulatory system. Only such a body can support the cultivator's next step in the cultivation. Being able to cultivate to the 9th level of the Qi practicing stage, Kangchon had almost all the meridians in his body opened, leaving only the last to most important meridians, the Ren and Dushi veins. The two veins were also known as the two bridges of heaven and earth, because they were the orifices that directly connected heaven and earth. And once they were opened, then the cultivator's speed of absorbing heaven and earth's spiritual Qi would be much faster. At the same time, the Ren and Du veins were also the necessary parts connecting the upper, middle and lower 3 dantians, which had to be opened if one wanted to become a cultivator. Kangchon carefully guided the thick spiritual energy in his body and began to try to impact the Ren Dui's second vein. He didn't dare to be careless, knowing that his previous failure was because when he was impacting the second vein of the Ren Duo, all the spiritual energy in his body suddenly disappeared. This time Kangchon didn't know if it would be like before, so he was very apprehensive in his heart at the moment. Outside, Emperor Dan was currently staring closely at the movements within Kangchon's body. His cultivation was so powerful that his divine sense could directly probe into Kangchon's body, and he could clearly see the changes within. At the same time, Kangchon had already begun to launch his first impact on the Renwu second vessel. It must succeed. With a firm conviction, Kangchon let out a roar in his heart. And as his mind mobilized, the thick spiritual energy within his body was like a shocking wave that rolled up in the ocean, violently impacting. Right at this moment, a hint of purple light flashed through the blood flowing in Kangchon's meridians, and then the spiritual energy in his body's meridians began to rapidly disappear at a speed visible to the naked eye. No. Kangchon looked at this familiar scene and let out an angry roar in his heart. Another failure, just like the previous 9 foundation establishment attempts. All of them were at this critical time when the spiritual energy in his entire body disappeared, and his cultivation dropped from the 9th level of the Qi practicing stage to the 1st level of the Qi practicing stage. Even though he had prepared his heart, at this moment, Kangchon could not help but despair. Even the foundation establishment pill couldn't allow him to establish a foundation. So how else could he establish a foundation in his life? Outside, Emperor Dan's eyes narrowed. What is that purple light? How did it suddenly appear in his blood? Emperor Dan's divine sense was powerful, so he naturally discovered a scene that Kang Tian hadn't paid attention to. And his intuition told him that the disappearance of the spiritual energy in Kang Tian's body might have something to do with that purple light. It was just that the violet light flickered away, leaving him no time to think too much about it. But once is not enough, can try again. Dan Huang thought and pulled out a foundation building Dan, and said to the somewhat disheveled Kang Tian in front of him, "Kid, you try again." Kang Tian was dumbfounded. The foundation building Dan, this kind of extremely high quality pills, even by Dan Huang casually, take out. Looks like this old man's stock is quite a lot. However, when he thought of the scene just now, he felt helpless in his heart. Even the foundation establishment pill couldn't help him build his foundation. What else could he do? However, since Emperor Dan didn't care about the foundation establishment Dan, Kang Tian was also happy to accompany him, and immediately began to rebuild his foundation according to Emperor Dan's instructions. Thus, Kang Tian's cultivation, who had taken the foundation establishment Dan, once again skyrocketed to the 9th level of the Qi practicing stage, and he began to impact the Ren and Duju chakras. However, the result remained the same as before, and all the spiritual energy in his entire body disappeared at the critical moment. Dan old. Kang Tian opened his eyes, disheveled, and looked at Dan Huang. Wasting to foundation establishment Dan has made him a little embarrassed. To know that this is the cultivation world's best elixir. Emperor Dan waved his hand. He didn't care about any foundation building pill. What he was curious about in his mind was the purple light that suddenly appeared in Kang Tian's blood just a moment ago. That purple light appeared again, and then the spiritual energy in Kang Tian's body began to disappear. Obviously, the Dan Emperor had already found the source of the disappearing spiritual energy within Kang Tian's body. Only that with his experience, he didn't know where this violet light came from. So he told Kang Tian what he had discovered. Violet light. Kang Tian was surprised. His eyes widened. Elder Dan, you're not blinkered. How could there be purple light in the blood? Bullshit. What kind of cultivation is the old man? How could he be blinking? Think carefully. Did your kid eat something special in the past? Or have some special experience? Emperor Dan rolled his eyes and said. Kang Tian thought about it, shook his head, and said, "No, the late generation has always stayed in the clan to cultivate, and has not encountered any special things, nor has he eaten any special things." That's strange. Emperor Dan frowned both eyebrows at his words. Kang Tian on the side, but at this time suddenly thought of one thing, that is, in his previous blood drop on the green tripod, to recognize the master also found a trace of purple light flickering in the blood. Only at that time he thought it was an eye blur, didn't pay attention to it. Now combined with the Dan Emperor's words, he knew at once that it might not be an eye blur. Kang Tian told Emperor Dan about the situation. In that case, then there is something wrong with your kid's blood. Just as well, you can try again and see. Emperor Dan said, as he once again took out a foundation building pill and threw it to Kang Tian. When Kang Tian saw that Emperor Dan didn't care about the foundation building pill, he wasn't polite either, and took the foundation building pill before taking it and starting to build his foundation. The result was still the same. His entire body's spiritual energy disappeared, but this time, Kang Tian carefully watched his blood. Unlike Emperor Dan, he also saw a flash of purple light in his blood. Obviously, Kang Tian also knew that the reason why he failed to build his foundation could be related to this purple light. However, even if he knew the reason, he didn't know how to fix it and could only look at Emperor Dan with bated breath. Try again. It was a little unnatural to be stared at by Kang Tian. Emperor Dan once again took out the foundation building pill. He had thought that helping Kang Tian build his foundation would be easy. But now he couldn't sit still, feeling that he was losing face. Kang Chon took the foundation building pill and tried again. The result was the same as always. Emperor Dan didn't say much this time. He directly pulled out 10 foundation building Dan and handed them to Kang Chon. He gritted his teeth and said, "Could you try again? I don't believe it. You're a small chi practicing stage cultivator. You can still make it difficult for me." Obviously, Emperor Dan had already gotten into the bull's eye and would not stop until he helped Kang Chon build his foundation. What else could Kang Chon do? He could only follow the Dan Emperor's instructions and continue to impact the foundation establishment. After eating 15 foundation establishment pills in this manner, the result obtained was still the same. Kang Chon looked at Dan Huang helplessly, thinking that he had already eaten 15 foundation establishment pills. His heart couldn't help but be staggered. If this were to be known by others, he would definitely be scolded for being a loser. Emperor Dan, however, was full of excitement as he said, "Kid, old man probably understands. You extend your hand." Kang Chon was puzzled, but he still stretched out his hand as he was told. Emperor Dan merged his fingers like a sword and gently slashed at Kang Chon's outstretched palm, and blood instantly bubbled out. However, in the next moment, Kang Chon's eyes widened, staring at his palm with a face full of incredulity, where instead of bright red blood bubbling out of the place that had been scratched by Emperor Dan, a hint of mauve liquid bubbled out instead. Mauve color. Right. It was mauve. Kang Chon saw that the blood emerging from the wound in his palm was actually mauve.